They were told the Americans would do unspeakable things to them. Torture, humiliation, death. But when 47 Japanese women stepped off that rusted military transport in San Francisco Harbor in March 1945, what broke them wasn't violence. It was a pair of hair clippers and a bar of white soap. And what happened next would haunt them forever. For 18 months, these women had lived with lice crawling through their matted hair. Their scalps bled constantly from scratching. They expected the Americans to mock them, to parade their suffering for propaganda cameras. Instead, a young army nurse looked at one trembling woman and said 5 words that would change everything. "We're going to help you." But here's the twist nobody saw coming. The fog rolled thick that March morning, swallowing San Francisco's skyline. The transport ship had crossed the Pacific in 16 days. The women, nurses, teachers, radio operators, clerks, had served the Japanese military across the Pacific Islands. Manila, Saipan. Tiny outposts that fell one by one as American forces pushed westward. Now they stood on deck in tattered uniforms, watching the enemy coastline emerge from the mist like a ghost. Ko Tanaka was 23. She'd been a military nurse in Manila when the city fell. For 18 months, she'd been moved from camp to camp, each worse than the last. Her once white uniform was now a patchwork of stains. Her hair hung in matted clumps. She could feel the lice moving constantly beneath the tangles. Her hands, scarred from forced labor, gripped the ship's railing. This was America, the land of the enemy, where, according to everything she'd been taught, her suffering would reach its final, brutal chapter. The other women huddled like frightened birds. Some were barely 18, girls who'd volunteered with dreams of honor. Now their eyes were hollow, their bodies marked by starvation and disease. One woman coughed constantly, a wet rattle that spoke of damaged lungs. Another limped from a wound that never healed. They had attacked Pearl Harbor. They had waged brutal war. They expected to be treated accordingly. Then the smell hit them. Not death, not decay. Coffee, fresh bread, frying meat. The aromas drifted from the port like whispers from another world. Ko inhaled deeply, her empty stomach clenching with forgotten hunger. Behind her, someone whimpered. Another woman began crying silently. The smell of American abundance was the first crack in everything they believed. But that was only the beginning. The sounds came next. English commands from the dock, but not harsh or threatening, just routine efficiency. Trucks rumbled. Men shouted to each other. Somewhere, impossibly, someone was laughing. The women exchanged glances. Where were the guns, the bayonets, the soldiers ready to prod them like cattle? Instead, American servicemen moved about their duties, barely glancing at the ship, as if 47 enemy prisoners were just another Tuesday. When the gangway lowered, Ko's legs trembled so badly she feared they'd collapse. She descended slowly, clutching a small cloth bag containing everything she owned. A photograph of her parents, a wooden comb with half its teeth missing, and a journal she'd hidden throughout captivity. Her feet touched American soil. She waited for the blow. The shout. Something. Instead, a young woman in an army nurse's uniform approached with a clipboard. The American looked at Ko's matted hair, her skeletal frame, her bleeding scalp visible through the tangles. Then, inexplicably, the American's eyes filled with something that looked like compassion. "Welcome to the United States," the nurse said softly. "My name is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. We're going to take care of you now." Ko didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the same tone she'd once used with frightened patients back in Manila. The cognitive dissonance was so profound she felt dizzy. This was wrong. Enemies didn't behave this way. Around her, other personnel guided the Japanese women toward waiting buses. No chains, no ropes, no weapons pointed at their backs. The women moved in stunned silence, waiting for the trap to spring. "They'll separate us," whispered Yuki, Ko's companion through the worst of the camps. "This kindness is a trick." Ko nodded, wanting to believe it, because the alternative was too terrifying to accept. The buses were clean. That detail struck Ko harder than anything else. The seats were worn but intact. The windows were whole. no smell of waste or rot. As she sank into cushions impossibly soft after months on bare concrete, she noticed something else. The driver, a young soldier with red hair and freckles, glanced at her in the rearview mirror and nodded. It was acknowledgement, recognition of her humanity, and it unsettled her more than violence ever could. Then they drove through streets that seemed to belong to a different planet. Buildings stood intact, windows gleaming. Shops displayed goods behind clean glass. People walked carrying packages, going about ordinary lives as if there were no war at all. Ko pressed her face to the window like a child. In Japan, cities were being bombed. Her mother's last letter described food shortages, blackouts, constant fear. Here, cars filled the streets. Here, people smiled. Here, the war seemed impossibly distant. The facility they reached was surrounded by wire fence, but even this was different. The buildings were painted, the grounds maintained. Flowers grew near the entrance, bright, almost offensive in their cheerfulness. Guards stood at the gate but didn't leer or threaten. They checked paperwork and waved the buses through. One guard was chewing gum. He blew a bubble as they passed, then grinned at his own foolishness. Ko had never seen a soldier do anything so casual while on duty. Inside the main building, the women were divided into groups of 8. Ko found herself with Yuki and 6 strangers, united only by captivity. They were led down a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and something floral. Real soap. Not the harsh lye blocks from the camps, but actual scented soap. A door opened. They were ushered into a room filled with steam. Tiled walls, shower heads, benches lined with clean towels. Then a Japanese-American woman in a medical uniform stepped forward. "My name is Dr. Yamamoto," she said in perfect Japanese. "I'm going to explain what happens next. Please don't be afraid." Dr. Yamamoto's presence was itself a shock. A Japanese face with American authority, wearing an American uniform, treating Japanese prisoners with Japanese courtesy. The women stared as if she were a ghost. "You've all been through terrible experiences," Dr. Yamamoto continued. "We can see you're suffering from malnutrition, infections, and severe lice infestations. Our first priority is the lice. This will require cutting your hair very short. For some, we may need to shave your heads completely. I know this is difficult. In Japanese culture, a woman's hair is precious. But the lice have burrowed too deep. There's no other way." The room fell silent. In Japan, a shaved head on a woman was shame. Punishment. What happened to adulteresses and criminals? To have their heads shaved by Americans felt like the ultimate humiliation they'd been warned about. Ko felt tears burning. So this was the cruelty. Not beatings, but this methodical stripping of dignity. She braced for rough hands, mocking laughter, cold hatred. But that's not what happened. Lieutenant Mitchell entered carrying a basket. She set it down and began removing items. Soft towels, bars of soap in paper wrappers, small bottles that smelled like medicine. Combs, not for now, but for later, for after. Then she pulled out something that made several women gasp. Cotton robes, white and clean, folded neatly. "These are for you to wear afterward," Mitchell said through Dr. Yamamoto. "We want you to be comfortable. We want you to feel clean. I know you're scared. I would be too. But I promise, we're not here to hurt you. We're here to help you heal." The shaving began with the most infested women. Ko watched as a nurse guided one companion to a chair. The Japanese woman trembled violently, but the American moved slowly, gently, explaining each action. The clippers hummed. The first clump of matted hair fell. With it fell dozens of lice. Tiny dark specks scattering across white tiles. The Japanese woman sobbed, but the nurse paused, placed a hand on her shoulder, and waited until the trembling subsided. When it was Ko's turn, she sat with eyes closed, hands clenched. She felt the nurse's fingers in her hair, gentle despite the tangles. "It's very bad," the nurse said to someone else. "We'll need to take it all." Ko understood enough English. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, determined not to cry. But when the clippers touched her scalp, when the first lock fell away, something broke inside her. Not from shame, from relief. The lice had tormented her for 18 months. Constant itching. scratching until she bled, feeling things crawl in darkness. Now, with each pass of the clippers, they were being removed. The nurse worked methodically, carefully, as if Ko's comfort mattered. When a tangle proved stubborn, she didn't yank. She applied something from a bottle, waited for it to soften, tried again. When the clippers nicked Ko's scalp, the nurse stopped immediately, cleaned the cut, applied a bandage, and apologized. Apologized. The enemy apologized for causing minor pain. Ko opened her eyes and looked at the American woman. She was young, perhaps Ko's age. Blue eyes, a color Ko had rarely seen. Those eyes held no hatred, no contempt, only focus and something that might have been pity, but not cruel pity, the pity of one human for another's suffering. When the shaving was complete, Ko raised a hand to her head. Smooth skin where tangled hair had been. She felt naked, exposed, but strangely light. The constant crawling sensation was gone. For the first time in 18 months, nothing moved on her scalp. The nurse held up a mirror. Ko saw a stranger, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, a bald head emphasizing how thin she'd become. But the reflection was also clean. No longer a suffering animal, a woman who might survive. Then came the showers. Real showers with hot water pouring endlessly. Ko stood under the stream and let it wash over her, not caring that others could see her skeletal body. She hadn't felt truly warm in so long. The camps had been cold, always cold. Cold from malnutrition, from fear, from certainty each day might be her last. But here, hot water cascaded, and she was warm. The soap was white and smooth and smelled like flowers. Ko held it for a long moment, just feeling its weight, its cleanness. Then she began to wash. The water running off her body was gray, then brown, carrying away months of grime. She scrubbed until her skin was red, until she'd used half the bar, until she felt like a different person. Around her, other women did the same, some crying, some laughing, some standing in silence as the water performed its miracle. Yuki caught Ko's eye and smiled, the first real smile in months. The soap and water said everything. After the showers came medical examinations. American doctors checked their eyes, hearts, lungs. Noted malnutrition, infections, scars. Asked questions through Dr. Yamamoto about symptoms and pain. Then, incredibly, they provided treatment. Antibiotics for infections. Vitamins for deficiencies. Ointments for skin conditions. Each woman received a small bag of medications with instructions translated into Japanese. Ko held her bag and stared. In the camps, medicine had been non-existent. Women died from infections easily treated. Now the enemy was handing out pills and creams as if health were something everyone deserved. But the true shock came in the mess hall. The women were led into a large room filled with tables, and the smell that greeted them was so overwhelming several stumbled. Ko's stomach cramped painfully, her body responding with desperate urgency to the promise of food. They were guided to a serving line where American cooks stood behind steaming trays. The cooks smiled at them, smiled. One woman, plump and grandmotherly, gestured encouragingly. Dr. Yamamoto translated. She says take as much as you want. There's plenty. The food was like nothing Ko had seen in 2 years. White rice, fluffy and perfect. Sliced meat in rich gravy. Vegetables green and fresh. Bread rolls soft and warm with actual butter. And fruit. Fruit. Ko stared at a bowl of sliced peaches in syrup and felt tears streaming. She'd dreamed of peaches. In her hunger and desperation, she'd dreamed of the peaches from her grandmother's garden in Osaka. Here they were, offered freely by the enemy. She took a plate, moving through the line in a daze. Her hands shook so badly a cook had to help with the rice. Another added extra meat, nodding encouragingly. When she reached the end, her plate was piled with more food than she'd eaten in a week at the camps. She found a seat where Yuki and others had gathered. For a long moment, no one ate. They stared at the abundance, unable to believe it was real. Then one woman, the youngest, picked up her fork and took a bite of meat. Her eyes widened. She chewed slowly, reverently. Then she began to cry. The crying spread like a wave. One by one, the women broke down as they ate, tears mixing with food they shoveled into their mouths. They cried from relief, from confusion, because the food was good and plentiful and freely given, and nothing in their experience had prepared them for such treatment from an enemy. Ko ate through her tears, barely tasting individual flavors, only aware of her stomach filling, warmth spreading through her body, strength slowly returning. She ate until her plate was clean. Then a cook appeared and offered more. More. As if there were no end to what the Americans would give. That night, Ko wrote in her journal for the first time in months. Today they shaved my head. I expected shame. Instead, I felt free. They gave us soap and hot water and clean clothes, medicine for our sickness, food until we could eat no more. I don't understand this. We're their enemies. We attacked their country. Our soldiers killed theirs. Yet they treat us as if we're worthy of care. Either everything I was taught is wrong, or this kindness is the cruelest trick of all. I don't know which possibility frightens me more. The barracks were simple but clean. Each woman received a bed with a mattress, real sheets, 2 wool blankets. After months on bare concrete or wooden planks, the softness felt obscene. Ko lay down and felt her body sink, cradled by something other than hard ground. She pulled the blankets to her chin and breathed their clean scent. Outside, night had fallen, and the facility settled into quiet routine. Footsteps of guards, distant generator hum. Somewhere, a radio played American music, a woman singing about love and loss. The other women settled into beds around her, newly bare heads resting on actual pillows. Some whispered in darkness. Others lay silent, too overwhelmed to speak. "Yuki," Ko whispered. "Are you awake?" "I can't sleep," Yuki replied. "Every time I close my eyes, I expect to wake back in the camp. I expect this to be a dream." Ko understood. The comfort felt dangerous, like a trap. But as hours passed and nothing terrible happened, exhaustion won, and she slept more deeply than she had in 18 months. But the real test was just beginning. The days that followed established a rhythm the women slowly learned to trust. Wake up announced by gentle bell, not harsh shouts. Breakfast in the mess brought new wonders. Eggs cooked to order. Bacon strips. Toast with jam and butter. Orange juice that tasted like liquid sunshine. The women were assigned light duties, nothing strenuous or punitive. Some worked in laundry, washing sheets and towels. Others helped in kitchens, peeling vegetables and washing dishes. A few, including Ko, were assigned to the medical building, sorting supplies and preparing treatment rooms. For this work, they were paid. Not much by American standards, but to women who'd labored for nothing under brutal conditions, any payment was astonishing. The camp script could be used at a small canteen selling items the women had forgotten existed. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, pencils and writing paper, small mirrors, hair ribbons for when their hair grew back. Ko saved her first week's wages and bought a new journal. She also bought a chocolate bar, her first in over 2 years. She ate it slowly, one small square at a time, letting each piece melt on her tongue. The sweetness was so intense it almost hurt. The physical changes came quickly. With regular meals and medical care, the women's bodies began recovering. Hollow cheeks filled. Dull eyes regained sparkle. Hair began growing back, thin at first, then thicker. Ko watched her reflection each morning, tracking the transformation. The skull-like face was slowly becoming human again. Bones that had jutted through skin were gradually covered with flesh. She was still thin, still marked by ordeal, but no longer dying. The enemy was making her healthy, giving her back her body, her strength, her life. The contradiction gnawed at her constantly. At night, she'd lie in her comfortable bed, stomach full, skin clean, and think about her family in Japan. What were they eating tonight? Were they warm? Were they safe? Letters from home were rare and heavily censored. The ones that arrived painted pictures of increasing hardship. Her mother wrote of stretching rice with sawdust, eating wild plants from hills, watching neighbors grow thin and sickly. "The war goes badly," her mother wrote, the words barely legible from the censor's heavy marks. "But we endure. We must endure." Ko read those words and felt guilt settle into her bones like poison. She was the enemy's prisoner, eating better than her own mother. The guilt became a constant companion. Ko saw it in other women too, a shadow passing over faces when meals were served, when doctors checked their improving health, when they received small wages for easy work. They were being treated well, and that treatment felt like betrayal. The Empire had asked for their service, sent them across the Pacific. Now here they were, growing fat on enemy food while Japan starved. Some women refused second helpings, punishing themselves for the crime of survival. Others ate everything offered, then wept in their bunks, torn between body's needs and heart's loyalties. Then came an even stranger revelation. The American abundance extended beyond the camp. Sometimes for work details or medical appointments, the women were transported through nearby towns. These journeys became exercises in disbelief. Shops displayed goods that had vanished from Japanese markets years ago. Children played in parks, cheeks round with nutrition. Gas stations pumped fuel for civilian cars as if petroleum were unlimited. Movie theaters advertised films. Restaurants advertised meals. Life continued in America as if the war were a minor inconvenience happening far away. The women pressed faces to bus windows, staring at this impossible world. This land of the enemy that seemed more paradise than purgatory. One afternoon, Ko's work detail was sent to help sort medical supplies at a local hospital. The building was enormous, gleaming with modern equipment belonging to the future. Doctors and nurses moved with purpose and confidence. Patients lay in clean beds in private rooms, attended by staff with seemingly unlimited resources. Ko worked alongside an American nurse named Betty, a cheerful woman from Ohio who chatted constantly despite the language barrier. Betty showed Ko photographs of her family: husband, 2 children, house with white fence and garden. "After the war," Betty said, pointing at herself then Ko, "peace, friends." She smiled and mimed shaking hands. Ko nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The idea of peace, of friendship with these people, was too strange to process. But the guards complicated everything further. They were mostly young men, some barely older than teenagers. Assigned to prisoner duty rather than combat, many seemed uncertain how to treat their charges. The Japanese women weren't the savage enemy they'd been taught to expect. They were thin, quiet, polite to the point of deference, clearly traumatized. The guards watched with curiosity rather than hatred. Some made small gestures of kindness. A piece of gum slipped through fence. A wave and smile during morning roll call. A moment of patience when communication failed. These gestures accumulated like water drops slowly wearing away stone. One guard in particular seemed drawn to Ko. Private James Walker, 19 years old, from a small Kansas town Ko had never heard of. Red hair, freckles, a gap between front teeth that showed when he smiled, which was often. He was assigned to the medical building where Ko worked, and he'd find excuses to be near her, asking questions she barely understood, pointing at objects and saying their English names. "Bandage," he'd say, holding up gauze. "Medicine," pointing at pills. "You learn English? Good. Important." His earnestness was so genuine Ko found herself trying to learn, repeating words back, watching his face light up when she got them right. James brought her things. Small at first: gum, a pencil, a magazine with pictures of American movie stars. Then larger things: a dictionary, Japanese English, worn but functional. A photograph of his family's farm, flat fields stretching to the horizon under huge sky. "Kansas," he said, pointing at the photo. "Home. After war, you visit. See America. Real America, not camp." Ko accepted these gifts with elaborate politeness drilled into her from childhood, bowing slightly each time, murmuring thanks in limited English. She didn't know what to make of James Walker. He was the enemy. His country's bombs were falling on her homeland. Yet he treated her with warmth that seemed utterly sincere. Other women noticed. Some warned Ko to be careful, convinced James's kindness was a ploy to extract information. Others were jealous, wishing they had someone paying such attention. Yuki, always practical, suggested Ko use James to learn English faster. Knowledge is survival, Yuki said. Use every tool available. So Ko studied with the dictionary James had given her, memorizing words and phrases, practicing when their paths crossed. Her English improved rapidly, and with it came something unexpected. Conversation. Actual conversation with an enemy soldier who talked about his mother's apple pie, his father's wheat fields, his dream of becoming a teacher after the war. He wasn't a monster. He was a boy far from home doing a job he hadn't chosen, trying to be decent in indecent times. The irony was unbearable. Ko would lie awake thinking about James, about Betty, about cooks who smiled and doctors who healed and guards who waved. She thought about the propaganda she'd absorbed, the images of American savagery, the warnings of torture and abuse. None of it matched what she was experiencing. Either the propaganda had been lies, or this camp was elaborate deception. The second option grew less convincing each day. What would be the point? The women had no valuable information. They posed no threat. They were simply prisoners beneath notice, unworthy of such elaborate manipulation. Which left the first option. Lies. The possibility that everything she'd believed about the enemy was wrong. The internal conflict deepened as spring turned to summer. Ko's hair grew back, covering her scalp in soft, dark fuzz that would eventually become thick enough to style. Her body filled out, curves returning where bones had jutted. She had energy now, strength she'd forgotten she possessed. She could walk across the camp without stopping to rest. Could work a full day without collapsing from exhaustion. The enemy had done this. The enemy had restored her body. And now that body felt like a traitor. Memory collided with reality in painful ways. Ko remembered the camps. The real camps. The ones run by her own side. She'd been transferred through several during captivity, and in each she'd witnessed treatment of prisoners. American prisoners. British prisoners. Australian prisoners. She'd seen them beaten, starved, worked to death. Heard their screams and done nothing because doing something meant joining them. She'd told herself the enemy deserved such treatment, that they were less than human, that Japan was fighting for survival against Western aggression. Now, eating American food and sleeping in American beds, she could no longer believe those justifications. If the Americans could treat their enemies with dignity, why couldn't Japan? The question haunted her, crept into prayers, dreams, waking thoughts. She tried to push it away, to focus on survival, on getting through each day. But it wouldn't be silenced. Other women wrestled with similar doubts. Ko heard them whispering in barracks at night, voices tight with confusion and shame. Perhaps we were wrong, one woman said, words barely audible. Perhaps we were the monsters all along. The statement hung in darkness, unanswered, because to answer would be to acknowledge a truth too devastating to accept. Ko sought refuge in her journal, pouring out thoughts she couldn't speak aloud. I was taught America was evil, that Americans were savages who'd brutalize us without mercy. But they've given me soap and food and medicine. They've given me dignity when I expected degradation. Private Walker teaches me English and shows me photographs of his home. The nurses treat my illness with genuine concern. Either I'm experiencing elaborate deception or everything I believed is false. If it's false, then what does that make me? What does it make my country? What does it make the war itself? I'm afraid to answer these questions. I'm afraid of what the answers might reveal. The collective wrestling happened in stages, like a fever breaking slowly. It started with small admissions, whispered confessions between friends after lights out. Women shared doubts, testing waters, seeing if they were alone. They weren't. As months passed and good treatment continued without pause, a consensus began forming. Unspoken, but understood. Something was wrong with what they'd been taught. Something fundamental had been false. Different women responded differently. Some retreated into denial, insisting American kindness was sophisticated propaganda, a trick to weaken resolve before real cruelty began. These women kept to themselves, maintained distance from American staff, accepted food and care with cold formality protecting them from gratitude. Others embraced the new reality with desperate enthusiasm, learning English, befriending guards, speaking openly about how wrong Japan had been. These women were viewed with suspicion by both groups, seen as traitors or fools. Most, like Ko, occupied uncomfortable middle ground. They couldn't deny what they were experiencing, but couldn't fully accept it either. They lived in suspended judgment, grateful for good treatment, but unwilling to draw larger conclusions. They told themselves this camp was perhaps an exception, that other prisoners elsewhere were suffering as expected. They told themselves kindness from individuals didn't erase larger evil of American imperialism. They told themselves many things, constructing bridges between old beliefs and new experiences. Bridges that grew increasingly unstable as evidence mounted. The generational divide was significant. Older women, those who'd served longest and been most thoroughly indoctrinated, resisted change most strongly. They'd built identities around service to the empire, around certainty about Japan's righteousness. To abandon those beliefs was to abandon themselves. Younger women, swept into war before beliefs fully solidified, were more willing to question. They had less invested in old narratives, less to lose from admitting error. Ko at 23 fell somewhere between. She'd believed deeply, served faithfully, but was still young enough for those beliefs to bend rather than break. Secret confessions became ritual. Women found quiet corners, pairs or small groups, and spoke truths they dared not acknowledge publicly. "I saw what we did to their prisoners," one woman admitted, voice trembling. "I saw the camps in the Philippines. What we did. It wasn't what warriors do. It was what monsters do." Another nodded, eyes wet. "My brother wrote from China. He described things I can't repeat. I burned the letter, but I can't burn the memory. We were told we were liberators. We weren't." These confessions bound women together in a web of shared guilt and dawning understanding. They weren't innocent. Their nation wasn't innocent. And the enemy they'd been taught to hate was treating them with mercy they'd never extended in return. Then came the deeper recognition. It wasn't just that Americans were kind. It was that their kindness seemed to flow from something larger, something systemic rather than individual. The camp followed rules. Food and medicine weren't gifts from generous captors, but entitlements under international law. The Geneva Convention, that strange document the women had heard mentioned but never understood, apparently guaranteed certain standards for prisoners of war. The Americans weren't being kind because they chose to be. They were being kind because they believed prisoners deserved kindness as a matter of right. This concept was revolutionary. In the world Ko had known, treatment depended on power and mercy. Those with power could treat those without power however they wished. Mercy was a gift, not a right, and gifts could be withdrawn at any moment. But here was a different philosophy, one suggesting human beings had inherent worth regardless of nationality or status. Prisoners were still people. Enemies were still human. Even those who'd attacked and killed American soldiers deserved food, shelter, medical care, and dignity. Ko turned this idea over in her mind like a strange artifact, unable to fully grasp it but unable to look away. The education programs reinforced this impression. The camp offered classes in English, American history, civics. Attendance was voluntary, but Ko went, driven by curiosity and growing facility with language. She learned about democracy, about rights, about a system where power flowed from the people rather than the emperor. She learned about the American Revolution, people who'd fought their own king for the right to rule themselves. She learned about the Constitution, about checks and balances, about the idea that even the most powerful leaders were bound by law. It was disorienting, like discovering the earth was round after spending your life believing it flat. The world wasn't what she'd been taught. America wasn't what she'd been taught. Perhaps nothing was. The films were even more confusing. The camp had a small theater showing American movies on weekend evenings. Ko attended with Yuki, both curious about this strange entertainment. They saw comedies about ordinary Americans falling in love, dramas about families overcoming hardship, musicals about dancers and singers pursuing dreams. The people in these films weren't monsters. They were recognizable, relatable, even likable. They worried about money and romance and the future. They laughed at jokes and cried at losses. They were undeniably human beings. And if the enemy was human, if they could create art and beauty and laughter, then the war itself took on a different character. It wasn't a struggle between good and evil, between civilization and barbarism. It was something more complicated, more tragic, more difficult to justify. The most dangerous weapon, Ko realized, wasn't bombs or guns or ships. It was this: the soap and the food and the films. The kindness that demanded nothing in return. The dignity given freely, as if all human beings deserved it simply by virtue of being human. These weapons destroyed not bodies, but beliefs. They didn't kill, but converted. And their effects were far more lasting than any physical wound. A woman might recover from a beating with hatred intact. But how could she recover from being treated with respect? How could she maintain contempt for an enemy who refused to be contemptible? Then came the turning point. An August morning, hot and bright, the camp received word that something terrible had happened in Japan. Guards grew somber. American staff spoke in low voices. Dr. Yamamoto gathered the Japanese women in the mess hall and told them, her face pale, that a bomb of unprecedented power had been dropped on Hiroshima. The details were unclear, but the destruction was said to be absolute. Tens of thousands dead. An entire city gone in a flash of light. Ko heard the words without understanding them. Hiroshima. She had cousins in Hiroshima. An aunt who made beautiful pottery. A temple she'd visited as a child. Gone? How could a city be gone? Around her, women were wailing, collapsing, calling out names of loved ones who might have been there. Yuki grabbed Ko's arm so hard it left bruises. "It can't be true," Yuki said, voice high with denial. "No bomb could destroy a city. It must be propaganda. American lies." But Dr. Yamamoto's face said otherwise. 3 days later, word came of a second bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The lies theory became impossible to maintain. In the days that followed, something shattered inside Ko. Not just grief for the dead, though she grieved. Not just fear for her family, though she feared. It was something larger, something fundamental. The empire she'd served, the nation she'd believed in, the war she'd supported, all of it had led to this. 2 cities erased, hundreds of thousands dead. For what? For glory? For territory? For an emperor who claimed divinity while his people starved? She thought about prisoners she'd seen in camps, the Americans and British and Australians who'd been beaten and starved and worked to death. She thought about the women here, treated with dignity by the very enemy Japan had brutalized. She thought about Private Walker teaching her English, about Betty showing her photographs of home. And she thought about the mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima, over Nagasaki, over everything she'd believed. She went to the small mirror in the barracks and looked at her reflection. Her hair had grown back, short but thick. Her face had filled out, no longer skeletal. She was healthy, alive, recovering while cities burned and people died. "Who am I?" she asked her reflection. The woman in the mirror had no answer. She wasn't the nurse who'd gone to Manila with certainty in her heart. She wasn't the prisoner who'd arrived expecting torture. She was someone new, someone still forming, someone who'd been broken down to nothing and was being rebuilt from parts that didn't quite fit together. The old Ko was dead. The new Ko didn't yet exist. There was only this moment, this mirror, this face that was hers, and yet strange. The announcement of Japan's surrender came on August 15th. The women gathered around a radio, listening to the emperor's voice for the first time in their lives. He spoke in archaic Japanese, words formal and indirect, but the meaning was clear. The war was over. Japan had lost. The divine wind had not blown. The enemy had won. Some women knelt and wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few refused to believe, insisting it was a trick, a false broadcast, anything but the truth. Ko listened to the emperor's voice and felt nothing. She'd expected despair, shame, rage. Instead, there was only emptiness, a vast hollow space where her beliefs had once lived. The war was over, Japan had lost, and she was alive in an American camp. treated with kindness by enemies who'd somehow become the only people keeping her from starvation. The months after surrender were strange ones. The women remained in camp while arrangements were made for repatriation. Some were eager to go home, desperate to find out if families had survived. Others dreaded the return, knowing Japan lay in ruins and life there would be harder than anything they faced in captivity. Ko fell into the second category. She wrote to her family but received no reply. She didn't know if they were alive or dead, if their home still stood, if there was anything left to return to. The uncertainty was torture of a different kind, a slow bleeding of hope no American kindness could stanch. Private Walker found her one evening sitting alone on a bench behind the medical building, watching sunset over California hills. He sat beside her without speaking. For a long time they simply watched the sky change colors together. "You scared?" he finally asked, his English slower and clearer than usual, the way he spoke when he wanted her to understand. "Go home, you scared." Ko nodded, not trusting her voice. "Me too," James said. "War over, but I scared. Different world now. Everything different." He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. A brooch shaped like a flower. Simple but pretty. "For you," he said. "Remember America. Remember not all enemy. Remember James." Ko took the brooch with trembling fingers. She wanted to say something profound, something that would capture everything she'd learned and felt during months in this impossible place. Instead, she said simply, "Thank you. I remember." The ship that took her home was crowded with returning prisoners and soldiers, all thin and haunted, all carrying invisible weights. Ko stood on deck as the Japanese coastline appeared, mountains rising green against gray sky. But as they drew closer, the green gave way to gray. Bombed buildings, burned forests, harbors choked with wreckage of ships. Japan had been devastated far more completely than she'd imagined. The newspaper reports and censored letters hadn't prepared her for this. Nothing could have prepared her for this. Her hometown was gone. Not damaged, not struggling, but simply gone. Where streets and houses had stood, there was only rubble and char. She wandered through ruins like a ghost, searching for landmarks she remembered, finding nothing. The temple where she'd prayed as a child was a pile of stones. The school where she'd learned to read was a crater. Her family home was ash. She stood in what had been the garden and wept, mourning not just the place, but everything it represented. Childhood, innocence, certainty, home. Her family, miraculously, had survived. She found them in a refugee camp outside the city, living in a tent with 3 other families. Her mother had aged 20 years. Her father walked with a limp from an air raid injury. Her younger sister, once bright and curious, had a dull look in her eyes speaking of things seen and suffered. They embraced Ko with desperate joy. But when they learned where she'd been held, when she told them about the food and medicine and soap, something changed. Her mother's embrace grew stiff. Her father looked away. Her sister whispered, "You were comfortable while we starved." The guilt Ko had carried all through captivity crystallized into something sharp and permanent. She had survived. She had even thrived. And her family could not forgive her for it. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. Ko built a new life, finding work as a nurse in one of the new hospitals, eventually marrying a quiet man who'd also served in the war and understood without needing explanations. She had children, then grandchildren. She watched her country transform from ashes to prosperity, from enemy to ally, from shame to pride. But she never forgot those months in the American camp. She never forgot the soap and showers and food. She never forgot Private James Walker and his dictionary and his brooch, which she kept in a small box on her dresser until the day she died. She told her children about the war, but not all of it. Some truths were too heavy for young shoulders. She told them about service and sacrifice, about endurance and survival. But she also told them about kindness from unexpected places, about enemies who were also human beings, about the power of dignity to heal wounds that cruelty could only deepen. Her children grew up with a different view of America than the one Ko had been taught. They grew up knowing the world was complicated, that people were complicated, that good and evil weren't distributed neatly along national boundaries. When Ko was 70 years old, she received a letter from Kansas. It was from James Walker's son, who'd found Ko's name in his father's papers after James's death. James had kept letters Ko had written over the years, occasional notes of thanks and updates on her life. He told his children about the Japanese nurse he'd met during the war, the one who taught him that enemies were also people. His son wanted Ko to know that his father had never forgotten her. He'd kept her photograph in his wallet until the day he died. Ko read the letter and wept. She wept for James, for herself, for all the young people swept up in a war not of their making. She wept for the hatred that had been taught and the kindness that had overcome it. And she wept for the simple truth that had taken her whole life to fully accept, that a bar of soap and a warm shower and a meal given freely could change the world more profoundly than any bomb. The Americans hadn't defeated Japan with weapons alone. They'd defeated it with humanity. And that humanity had planted seeds growing into friendship, into alliance, into a peace that lasted generations. The soap became more than soap. The shaved heads became more than hygiene. The meals became more than nutrition. They became proof that even in the darkest times, even between the bitterest enemies, human beings are capable of treating each other with dignity. For those Japanese women who stepped off the ship in San Francisco Harbor expecting torture and finding kindness instead, the memory of clean water and white soap stayed with them forever. It reminded them that the world wasn't as they'd been taught. It reminded them that mercy is sometimes more powerful than cruelty. It reminded them that even enemies can choose to be human. Ko Tanaka lived to be 92 years old. In her final years, she often told her great-grandchildren about the war, about the camp, about the bar of soap that changed everything. "They could have treated us like animals," she'd say, voice thin with age but clear with conviction. "We had treated their soldiers like animals. We expected nothing else. But they gave us soap. They gave us food. They gave us back our dignity. And that kindness was harder to carry than any cruelty would have been. Because cruelty confirms what you believe. Kindness forces you to change." She'd pause then, eyes distant, seeing faces and places long gone. "Remember that," she'd tell her great-grandchildren. "When you have power over someone, when you could choose cruelty without consequence, choose kindness instead. You never know what seeds you might plant." And that's a story worth remembering. In a war filled with horror and hatred, small acts of humanity made differences lasting generations. The women who arrived as enemies departed as something more complicated. Certainties shattered, hearts opened, lives changed by soap and showers and meals given freely. They carried that lesson back to Japan, planted it in their families, watched it grow into understanding. The war ended in 1945, but its lessons continue speaking to us today. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more untold accounts from World War II history. These stories buried in time still have the power to change how we see the world and each other. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, kindness is never wasted, even on an enemy.